I am Inspector, and I solved mystery. Welcome to my new case. It was one of those evenings when Oxford appears to fold back into itself, the streets emptied of all but the most dutiful cyclists, and the rain making its usual modest theatre on the stone. I had wandered without reason, or perhaps with too many, toward Merton Street, whose lamps trembled faintly in the drizzle. The night had no audience but me, and I felt myself drifting into that half-solitary state where the past presses closer than the present. Somewhere behind the shuttered chapel, a choir rehearsed. Not well, not badly, just earnestly, which is the greater pity. A snatch of Kyrie reached me across the wet air, and I thought how pitifully few prayers are answered, even in this city of bells. I leaned against the railings, watching the faint glow of a candle in some upper room, and pretended to myself that it was sufficient company. I had with me, as usual, the Times crossword. It was an obstinate one. A clue read, Janus of rooms one face toward Hush 5. I had tried doors, rooms, even gates, but nothing held. Janus itself seemed to press its nose against the bars of the solution. I folded the paper, irritated, but the unease of the clue stayed with me. Like a whisper, you know, belongs to a familiar voice, though you cannot place the face. When I returned to my flat, the radio was playing Mozart, too slowly, as though the announcer had confused melancholy with solemnity. I poured a whiskey, told myself it would be the last for the evening, and knew it would not. It was then that the telephone rang. Strange's voice, cheerfully weary, as though he had just finished a cigar that he didn't much like. A woman's been found at St. Simeon's, you know it, the little college by the water, not much to look at, but frightfully proud of its benefactors. I asked the obvious question. Dead, he said. Natural causes, they think. But it smells of embarrassment more than illness, if you take my meaning. Strange was never so careless as he liked to appear, and I took his meaning. Elspeth Arbery, he added. Do you remember her? The name trembled in some half-forgotten corridor of my memory. A widow, generous with the college funds, fond of poetry once upon a time. The kind of woman Oxford likes to misplace until her cheque-book opens. She'd been found in one of the warden's rooms, Strange continued, a door left ajar as if politely. Nothing violent so far as anyone can say. Suicide, perhaps, or something quieter. I muttered that silence is not always quiet, though I doubt he heard me. He urged me down to St. Simeon's in the morning, with Lewis to keep me steady, and hung up with the relief of a man who had passed a distasteful parcel into other hands. I sat for some time after, staring at the crossword folded on the table. I unfolded it, read the clue again. Janus of rooms, one face toward Hush 5. It was not doors nor gates. Janus was the Roman god with two faces, one looking back, one forward. The god of thresholds. The answer was plain and yet refused to write itself. I left it blank. The whiskey glass had left a pale ring on the table, like the mark of something absent. The radio crooned itself into a program of weather reports. More rain tomorrow, naturally. I told myself that a death in Oxford, even a quiet one, was no concern of mine until the morning. Yet I could not help rehearsing the scene as Strange had painted it. An old woman, a donor, in a room that was not hers, a door left open not by accident, but almost by intention. Two doors, perhaps. One closed, one opened, and somewhere behind them, silence arranging itself like furniture. I switched off the lamp, but the clue remained inside my head, unyielding. Lewis drove as he always did, though with a patience that suggested a man more resigned than cautious. I sat beside him, half listening to the tires whisper along the wet road, half absorbed in the memory of a crossword clue I had left unsolved the night before. The drizzle had thickened to a kind of watery veil, through which the towers of Oxford appeared briefly, then disappeared again like reluctant ghosts. St. Simeon's revealed itself without ceremony, crouched by the river in a modest enclosure of stone and ivy. It had never been one of the grand colleges, though it wore its age as if that alone were distinction enough. The gate swung open not with welcome, but with a sort of weary acquiescence, and we entered into the quadrangle, where puddles lay untroubled by footsteps. The warden, Julian Merrick, met us beneath the cloisters. He was handsome in the way of men who know it, but his charm seemed worn at the edges, as though rehearsed too many times. He spoke of tragedy with an urbane gravity, his voice low enough to suggest reverence, yet brisk enough to imply inconvenience. The college, he said, had lost a benefactor, and benefactors were rare enough to be mourned, even by those who had not cared for the woman herself. Beside him, the bursar Phillida Keslake smiled with a precision that felt calculated. She murmured that Mrs. Arbery had been much loved by some, respected by all. The cadence of her words struck me more than the content. It was the kind of phrase that could be recycled for anyone of means. Lewis asked the expected questions about where and when, and Merrick answered with practiced ease. Arbery had been found in a small side room of the warden's lodging. The door had been ajar, a curious detail, though Merrick smoothed it over by saying that age brings forgetfulness, that old women often leave things half done. I noticed how he avoided saying who had discovered her. We were then introduced to others, as if in a gallery where each portrait required its caption. Professor Daniel Keene, a visiting American scholar of Milton, gave us a smile that was almost performative. He spoke of how deeply he regretted the loss, though he had scarcely known the lady, and managed to misquote Eliot within a minute of conversation. Human voices wake us, he declared, when what Eliot wrote was drown us. It was not ignorance, I felt, but something else, an instinct to bend words to his own convenience. The librarian, Mrs. Marion Copley, appeared in her black cardigan like a figure drawn out of the wood itself. Recently widowed, they whispered, though no one seemed willing to name the dead man. Her eyes seemed fixed upon some private past, but when she spoke of Arbery, it was with a warmth the others lacked. Arbery had been a poet once, she told me, and had published under a pseudonym during her undergraduate days. I asked if she recalled the pseudonym, but she shook her head slowly. Lost to time like so much else. And then there was Livia Hale, the graduate student, young and brittle, with that careful confidence peculiar to the clever. She had been editing Arbery's old diaries for some small research project, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that one page had gone missing, the entry for a November evening in Metz, 1967. She said it with the bright detachment of someone who half suspects the page had been removed for reasons more interesting than academic. The rain tapped at the mullioned windows as we stood in hall, where a table still bore the remnants of a dinner laid but never begun. Our place card with Arbery's name had been half written. The pen halted midway through the second letter of her Christian name, and beside it an envelope addressed to the warden in a hand too careful, as if disguised. I picked it up, read the lines once, then again, and returned it to the table. Lewis asked if it was a suicide note. Merrick said gently that it was merely an apology, an old woman's reluctance. But I thought of the words she had used. Fear of the second door. A curious phrase. Unnecessary, unless it was meant to conceal something by pretending to explain it. As we left the room, I felt the faintest stir of unease. It was not grief that hung over St. Simeon's, nor even shock. It was something quieter, as if the college had been holding its breath and now exhaled in relief. In the quad, the rain had deepened into steady sheets, filling the stone gutters with a sound like whispered applause. Lewis muttered that the place gave him the creeps. I said nothing, but in my pocket my fingers found the folded crossword once more. The unanswered clue pressed against me like a small insistence, its silence louder than any explanation Merrick had given. The Bishop's Ferry guest house sat with an almost apologetic air by the river, its whitewashed walls dimmed by weather, and its garden resigned to nettles. Lewis parked the car with his usual country care, and I followed him into a hallway that smelled faintly of wet ash and marmalade, as if breakfast and extinguished fires had quarrelled there for years. The proprietor, A pale man with the expression of someone forever expecting an apology he will not receive, fussed with the kettle as we signed the register. I let Lewis scrawl his name with the diligence of a schoolboy, while my eyes strayed to the earlier entries. There it was. Professor Daniel Keene from New Haven, the letters written with a confident slant as though each word were pressing its claim on the page, and directly beneath another entry, only an initial E and a surname smudged as if blotted by a left-handed writer. The rest of the line was neat enough, but that letter, blurred into anonymity, looked like an afterthought or a deliberate concealment. Only one key was missing from the hooks on the wall. 2 entries, 1 key, a detail too small for Lewis, who was admiring the guest house brochures, but large enough for me to pocket in memory. The proprietor asked if we'd like tea, and Lewis accepted with the innocence of a man who has not yet learned that hospitality often conceals more than it offers. While the man busied himself with the tray, I glanced at the fire notice pinned near the stairs. A crude plan of the house, sketched with lines of faded ink, warned, "In emergency, use the second door to the landing," a phrase that lodged itself beside Arbery's letter the night before. The second door. As we climbed, I pressed lightly on the banister and noted the creak of the second step. Not the ordinary moan of old wood, but a sharper sound, as if the step had been tested more often than the rest. Someone had rehearsed their passage here. I said nothing to Lewis, who was already at the landing, looking dutifully for clues he would not find. From the window at the turn of the stairs, I saw the car. A black saloon, expensive enough to insist upon discretion, parked half into the shadow of a U. Its number plate caught my eye. Something 7A, though the last character was obscured by a splash of mud so symmetrical that it looked more like a veil than an accident. The driver had meant it to be unreadable, which was the same as meaning it to be read, only wrongly. Lewis asked if I thought the car belonged to the American. I muttered that vanity plates were rarely bought by scholars of Milton. He chuckled, though I had not meant it as a joke. The tea arrived upstairs, delivered on a tray that trembled in the proprietor's hands. He set it on a side table, apologized for the draught, and departed with the gait of a man always leaving behind some unfinished confession. I watched the steam curl above the cups, then turned my attention back to the register in my notebook, the blurred initial E. Why the hesitation? Why the smudge? People do not miswrite their own names, unless, of course, they wish to. Lewis sipped, pronounced it decent, and asked if I believed Mrs. Arbery had stayed here. I told him no, or at least not under her name. He frowned, puzzled. He said there were 2 rooms, 2 entries, 1 key gone. Perhaps one of them had been double-booked. I said nothing. Sometimes silence lets a deduction ripen unseen. Outside, the river muttered against its banks as if keeping secrets in a language we had long forgotten. I thought again of the crossword clue, Janus of rooms, 1 face toward hush. 2 rooms, 1 key, 2 names, 1 erased, and somewhere between them, a silence arranged like furniture. Lewis suggested we leave. I lingered by the door, listening once more to the stairs. The second step creaked obligingly. A stranger, passing often enough, might learn to avoid the sound, to erase himself. But erasures, I have learned, are only ever half complete. We stepped out into the mist where the saloon sat in its shadow, unclaimed. I lit a cigarette, watched the smoke thin into the damp air, and wondered who had walked through the second door, and why the register had decided to keep its own counsel. The library at St. Simeon's was a place where silence had settled so thoroughly that one suspected even the dust had agreed to stay still. It was there that they showed me the letter, a single sheet, folded with unnecessary neatness, as if careful creases might disguise the tremor in the hand that had written it. Elspeth Arbery apologized for a delay, though delay was hardly the sort of sin that required forgiveness. She was not well, she said, and she feared the second door. That phrase, the second door, disturbed me more than her apology. It had the ring of something rehearsed, a phrase borrowed rather than spoken. I read the letter once, then again, aloud this time under my breath. The rhythm was wrong. The commas fell where Elspeth, as I remembered her, would not have paused. Someone else's breathing pattern, transplanted into her words. Marion Copley stood beside me, patient in her widow's black, her perfume faintly lavender. She told me Elspeth had been a poet once, though the verses were tucked away under a pseudonym. She had written with promise before life had redirected her energies into marriage, committees, and the occasional check. Marion's voice softened as she spoke, as if she felt the loss of a talent she herself might have cherished. She said she had once seen some of those poems, delicate lines scrawled in a notebook that had long since vanished. I asked if she recalled the pseudonym. She shook her head. Time erases more than people. Livia Hale, restless as always, offered her contribution with the bright sharpness of the clever. The diary Elspeth kept as an undergraduate, the one she had been editing, was missing a page. November 1967. She said it as though the date itself might bear weight, though she didn't know what it carried. Perhaps, she added lightly, it had been torn out by Elspeth herself. I thought otherwise. Diaries do not mutilate themselves. We found Daniel Keene among the shelves of elegies, leaning on Milton as if on a cane. He spoke of tragedy in the smooth tones of a man for whom grief is always an abstract. When I asked what he thought of the letter, he smiled and quoted Eliot, or rather misquoted him. Human voices wake us, he said, as if finding hope in the words. But the line, of course, is drown us. It was no innocent slip. Americans, he explained with amused defiance, prefer optimism. Lewis muttered later that it was a harmless mistake. I told him mistakes are rarely harmless in poetry. I returned to the letter in my pocket, unfolded it under the lamp in my rooms that night. The ink was steady enough, but the hand too formal, too deliberate. Elspeth's true correspondence, from what little I recalled, had flowed more naturally, with sudden loops of wit and impatience. This letter had been edited by someone who understood appearances better than honesty. The phrase repeated itself in my mind, fear of the second door. I remembered the fire notice in the guest house, directing occupants to a secondary exit, and I recalled too the careful smudge of that initial E in the register. Doors registers omissions. The pattern was no clearer than a fogged window, yet I felt the condensation thinning. Marion lingered as I put the letter away. She asked if I believed Elspeth had been frightened. I told her everyone is frightened, but most of us hide it with better prose. She smiled faintly at that, though the smile did not last. She spoke then of Merrick the warden with a kind of reticent affection. They had known one another long ago, she admitted, though time had altered both their circumstances. Admiration, she said, can survive long past its usefulness. Her candour moved me more than I cared to admit. Lewis returned with the post-mortem preliminaries, nothing violent, nothing conclusive. Heart failure was the easy answer. But it was too easy. I thought of the half-written place card at dinner, the envelope with its laborious script, the page excised from a diary. Too many small details excused as accidents. When the rain began against my window later that evening, I poured myself another whiskey and unfolded the crossword. One clue lingered unanswered. The second door, perhaps, was no more than metaphor. Yet metaphors, like misquoted lines of poetry, reveal more of the writer than of the world, and as I read the letter for the second, the third, the fourth time, it seemed to me that Elspeth had not been writing her own words at all. She had been lent them. And one should always be suspicious of borrowed language. The cellar list was the first thing that drew me, though Lewis thought it no more than a ledger of dusty bottles and older debts. To me it was a palimpsest of intentions. Wine has always told the truth more plainly than people. We had been taken down by the bursar, Phillida Kestlake, who carried her torch as though it were a sceptre. The cellar smelled of cork and damp limestone, an air that had absorbed secrets as thoroughly as it had absorbed spilled claret. She pointed to the racks with a precision bordering on pride. Mrs. Arbery, she said, had been a generous patron of music once, but her revised bequest, still unsigned, would now endow English. I caught the flicker of disdain on her lips, as though she had no quarrel with literature itself, but with the idea of music demoted in its favor. Lewis, earnest as ever, asked if the will had been finalized. "Not yet," the bursar said, and the word fell like the strike of a gavel. The document was prepared, the witnesses arranged, but Aubrey had hesitated at the last hour. She called it a matter of conscience. The college called it a matter of survival. Later in the hall, Merrick explained with his practiced charm that Aubrey had been torn between loyalties. Music had been her first love, but English, so he claimed, spoke to her past, her youthful days when words meant more than notes. He said this with a sorrow that might have been real, though it was delivered with the cadence of a man accustomed to persuasion. Mrs. Marion Copley lingered after the others had drifted away, her cardigan drawn about her, as if to ward off more than the draught. She confessed, not without a faint smile of apology, that she had admired Merrick once many years ago when admiration had seemed natural before it became costly. Her honesty was oddly disarming. I felt both moved and irritated, for candor is a gift I rarely receive without envy. Lewis showed me the ledger again, pointing to a small irregularity. One purchase of wine for the cancelled dinner had been charged not to the college, but to the guest house. He assumed it a clerical error. I told him errors were rarely clerical when wine was involved. Someone had been careless or someone had been clever. That evening, alone in my rooms, I thought again of the altered will. A scholarship to English instead of music. To most it was an academic distinction, no more than a polite quarrel between disciplines. To me it was a fault line. Who gained? Who lost? Choir directors are no less ambitious than professors, and sometimes more dangerous in their resentments. I poured a glass of whiskey and returned to my crossword. One clue lingered unanswered from days before. Threshold God, two-faced 5. The answer came easily now, Janus, yet I hesitated before writing it in. There was something in the symmetry, the gaze both forward and back, that unsettled me. 2 faces, 1 God. 2 doors, 1 fear. The rain returned against the window, insistent as argument. I considered the half-stained place card left at the abandoned dinner. The pen had halted halfway through Elspeth's name, as if interrupted or unwilling. Had she meant to sign the will that evening? Had she wavered at the threshold, or had someone else pressed her into hesitation? Lewis would have said we needed facts, not speculation. But facts are rarely facts until one interprets them, and interpretation is a dangerous habit. I thought again of the wine purchase, charged to the guest house, not the college. Why should that matter? A triviality, yes, yet trivialities, when properly observed, can expose the structure beneath the stage scenery. I closed the crossword without filling in Janus. The answer was correct, of course, but it felt premature. Better to leave it blank, as Elspeth had left her bequest unsigned. A space where certainty should be and yet was not. I finished the whiskey, listened to the floorboards creak above me in the empty flat, and thought of Marion's unguarded words, of Merrick's rehearsed ones, and of the silence with which Phillida Keslake had pronounced the word "not yet." Silence, I have always believed, is never absence. It is presence withheld, and somewhere between wine and will, between music and English, between what is charged and what is erased, I felt the outline of a pattern begin to stir. The chapel at St. Simeon's sounded like rain pretending to be music. I went because Merrick thought rehearsals should continue, and because the living cling to their patterns. Ainsworth, the choir director, carved the air into tidy measures. At the small organ sat Dacre, a thin doctoral candidate who played as if joy were immodest. After an anthem stumbled to its amen, Ainsworth approached with the grave briskness of a headmaster. He had heard rumours, he said, of Mrs. Aubrey's bequest straying from music to English. He would never disparage literature, he added, though his tone did the work for him. I replied that tradition deserves more than merely being old, and he introduced Dacre, as if handing over a fragile instrument. Dacre's voice was soft. He seemed always to apologize, even when stating facts. He had been in chapel the previous evening. Some scales, a psalm, an Angelus bell at past, then word that dinner was postponed. He bicycled home along the towpath. It was precise, memorized. While Lewis took dates and times in the vestry, I wandered the gallery. The rail carried a small smear of varnish, bright against dull oak. On the mat by the organ, a flake of gloss lay light as skin. The anteroom door in the warden's lodging had been newly varnished. When Dacre bent to gather music, a lace-edged handkerchief fell from his sleeve, embroidered, an initial that might have been A. He flushed, said it was useful for dust. Men do not dust instruments with lace unless sentiment has rewritten habit. Later, in the porter's lodge, a bicycle propped against the desk showed the same specks along the handlebar. "Considerate fellow," the porter said, "always brings it in out of the rain." A tidy narrative assembled itself. A young accompanist loyal to music fears the endowment's demotion. He begs the donor for a private word. She falters. An accident is curated into despair. The handkerchief becomes pathos. The varnish becomes evidence. The alibi becomes consolation. But the better thing had already turned. Ainsworth told us the bell rang before the warden entered hall. The college bell is not an oracle. It follows rank. When the warden is due to appear, the porter waits for the sight of him and then rings. I had watched that ceremony the week before. Ainsworth's memory reversed cause and consequence, useful if one wished to move people earlier without admitting the edit. I asked Dacre gently to repeat his times. He preserved them intact. He added that he polished the keys after practice. Hence the handkerchief. I asked whether the lace was his. "It is now," he said. "Back in hall I studied the rehearsal list." A psalm set not usually attempted midweek had been penciled, then erased so faintly I could read the ghost of it. A decision made and unmade. We returned to the chapel at dusk. From outside, the river kept its patient quarrel with the bank. I stood beneath the gallery and listened to the boards. The second plank creaked more sharply than the rest, precisely the step one would learn to avoid. Somebody had practiced being inaudible. Lewis proposed we seize Dacre, while the story still held together. I said it was too neat. He asked what was wrong with neatness. I told him it tempts clever men to confuse pattern with proof. At the gate I wrote a word in my notebook and crossed it out. Janus. Two faces looking in contrary directions. The face turned backward belonged to sentiment. The face turned forward belonged to timing. Bells follow wardens, not the other way. The evening, as told to us, had been edited after the fact. I thought of the lace turning into a noose of inference, a varnish migrating like guilt from one surface to another, and of a bell whose single note, properly placed, could reorder an entire evening's memory. I let the red ribbon lie where it gleamed. It was handsome, but it did not fit. The choir resumed, dutiful and thin, and the notes rose like breath on a cold morning, visible, temporary, gone. Ambiguity for now could sing the descant. The senior common room smelled of old wool and older judgments. Portraits kept vigil above the mantel, each face confident that posterity would prefer it. On a side table, a glass case displayed relics from glossier decades. Boat club ties, a rusted oarlock, a program from a play in which everyone had been young and promising. I had come for the people but paused for the objects. Things tell the truth with less rehearsal. In the case lay an old-school photograph, 1967, inked in a librarian's hand. I recognized Elspeth Arbery at once. Not center, not edge, but turned slightly as if the camera were an interruption she would forgive. Below the photograph, a row of nameplates marched dutifully along. One space gaped blank where a brass strip should have been. It was not fallen. It was absent. A gap has a different grammar from a loss. Merrick drifted in with the elegance of a man accustomed to doorways opening. He asked if the photograph stirred anything useful, and I said that youth rarely confesses except unintentionally. He smiled. A handsome sadness hovered about him like aftershave. A plausible man, then, for a plausible motive. The bequest delayed, the college's anxiety sharpening. A tidy, false solution offered itself, and I kept it in my pocket. Lewis joined us from the porter's lodge with a visitor book. A number plate, he said, had been recorded the previous afternoon. Oxf 879A. The saloon at the guest house wore Oxf 8797A, a neat extra digit tucked where suspicion would strain its eyes. We took the book back to the lodge. The porter's window framed a face arranged for helpfulness. He declared that he had corrected a smear in the visitor's handwriting. He had inserted the 7 to avoid confusion. I looked at entry and then at his pen, which was black but incapable of becoming yesterday. The 7 stood too straight, too recent, like a guest arriving after grace. I thanked him and felt the small click a lie makes when it fits its hole. Outside, the quad kept its puddles like polished coins. I tried the story for size. Merrick, cornered by accounts, tolerates despair and profits from silence. It had the right measurements. Yet his melancholy felt earned, not arranged. Guilt is spikier and tends to chatter when unattended. I let the story out again like a suit concealing someone else's posture. We returned to the SCR. Marion Copley was there, smoothing a tablecloth with the care of a woman who would not give grief the satisfaction of creases. She said the photograph had been displayed since last term. She had mounted it herself. I asked about the missing nameplate. She frowned. There had been a name. She would check the box. Livia Hale arrived with the impatience of the clever, announced that photographs tell the agreed lie, and departed before the air settled. I bent closer to the photograph. In the second row, left of Elspeth, a young man's gaze fell not on the lens but beyond it, toward something just out of frame. The expression was skepticism shading into disdain. The absent nameplate belonged to him, I suspected, and absences are rarely accidental in colleges that catalogue their spoons. I stood, drifted to the window. The saloon across the lane had not moved. On its plate the added 7 seemed fraction darker, perhaps newer, perhaps wetter. Vanity plate strut. This one winced. A stick-on digit, then, or my wish to make it one. Doubt has fingerprints. A bell struck somewhere, not quite on the hour. Lewis asked what I made of the mismatch. I said that numbers, like alibis, improve by editing, and that someone had practiced penmanship on reality. He nodded, pleased without understanding. Merrick reappeared to say the choir would honour Mrs. Arbery at evensong. He spoke gently, and I believed the gentleness. Yet I kept my eye on the gap beneath the photograph, on the arithmetic of plates and on the scratch at the base of the visitor book, where a left hand might smudge and a right hand might revise. The day, like the face in the second row, declined to look me in the eye. The library at St. Simeon's had the smell I trusted most in Oxford. Not quite dust, not quite paper, but something older, as though every breath exhaled in the room had remained, distilled into silence. I went there after supper, drawn less by duty than by a peculiar restlessness. Books behave like witnesses. They cannot lie, but they can choose which truths to reveal. Marion Copley met me among the high ladders, her cardigan a shade darker than the oak panelling. She carried a thin pamphlet as one might carry a relic. This, she said, had surfaced in a box of donor papers, poems unsigned, stitched together with the cheapest binding, the sort of vanity press that never reached a bookshop window. She pressed it into my hand with the air of giving up a secret. I climbed the narrow staircase to the mezzanine and opened it under the lamp. The lines were awkward, raw, occasionally striking, a young poet's voice, bruised with more experience than her years allowed. At the bottom of the title page, a Greek epigraph. 2 doors open, both lead away. The words trembled against the evening, like an echo of Arbery's final letter. I read more carefully. First letters of each line stood taller than they should, an acrostic spelled by accident or by design. Mary, then a break, then Anne. I closed the pamphlet and looked down at Marion herself, arranging returned volumes into obedient rows. The name revealed itself in the binding, though she had not spoken it. Her blush when I descended with the book was not for me but for the younger self she had hidden in those verses. She murmured that we all had beginnings we would rather misplace. I told her beginnings never stay lost. Libraries have long memories. She turned away, but not before I saw the glimmer of something halfway between shame and pride. I returned to the pamphlet. A later poem, more brittle in tone, carried another acrostic, keen. The letters glared through the page like an accusation, though the verses themselves spoke of false dawns and disappointed mentors. Whether Daniel Keene had written them, or merely inspired them, I could not yet say. But the coincidence was too neat to be coincidence. Livia Hale appeared then, restless as always, her steps too quick for a library. She asked if I had found anything worth hiding. I told her poetry hides everything worth finding. She laughed, sharp, dismissive, and admitted she had discovered the pamphlet in the donor box but hesitated to show it. Protecting the living from the dead, she called it, though her tone suggested she enjoyed the withholding. She said the past belongs to those clever enough to edit it. When she had gone, Marion remained by the shelves, her hands clasped before her like a penitent. She asked whether the verses proved anything. I told her proof is for courts. Poems prove only that someone once felt something. Still, I folded the pamphlet into my coat as if it might explain more than it admitted. On my way out, I paused before the catalogue drawers, those neat little boxes of alphabetized certainties. One card hung out a fraction farther than the rest, as though recently consulted. The heading read Arbery Elspeth. Beside it, a note in faded ink. See also Copley M. The connection had been filed quietly years ago, and only now did I notice it. A library again, refusing to forget. Later in my rooms I poured a whiskey and read the pamphlet again under my lamp. The line endings sagged into themselves, weary of their own revelations. I tried them against my crossword, as I often did with words. Doorway God 5. Janus fit neatly. But what interested me was not the answer but the crossings. They spelled other words if you permitted yourself to cheat. And cheating, I reflected, is only another way of rearranging the truth. The coded poems did not deliver certainty, but they whispered of entanglements left unfinished. Marion's blush, Keene's misquoted Eliot, Livia's withheld diary page, all pointed to a history the college preferred to leave unarchived. Yet it was here in the stacks, speaking through misaligned letters. When I closed the pamphlet, the Greek epigraph returned to me. 2 doors open, both lead away. I thought of Elspeth Arbery, of her last letter, of the silence arranged around her body. Perhaps the second door was not a corridor at all, but a poem, written once, hidden always, waiting to be read twice. I sat alone in the chapel that evening, though the air still held the residue of the choir. The river just beyond the wall fussed at its banks with a ceaselessness that belonged less to sound than to memory. I unfolded Elspeth's letter once more, read it in silence, then aloud to the empty nave. Words are treacherous companions. They alter when spoken. I noticed how the commas tugged against the rhythm, forcing pauses where no breath was needed. It was not her cadence. Someone else had taught the hand how to hesitate. The phrase returned, insistent, fear of the second door. At first it had seemed metaphor, a poet's indulgence. But in Oxford, metaphors have a way of solidifying into stone, into corridors, into keys. Lewis came to fetch me with his usual mix of loyalty and impatience. The guest house proprietor had something to report, he said, though he had tried to make it sound trifling. I followed him back through the drizzle. The lane smelled of wet bark and stale tobacco. The proprietor, nervous even in the act of lighting his own cigarette, told us that there had been a disturbance the afternoon before. 2 figures, one he recognized as Professor Keene, the other glimpsed only in profile. A woman, perhaps, though he would not swear to it. They had moved between rooms in some quiet quarrel, and then one of them had used the service passage. He gestured towards the staircase. The second door, he called it in his half-apologetic way, a side exit from the landing, not much used, leading to a narrow passage that circled the lounge and opened at the rear. In an emergency, he said, guests could avoid the main stairs. His words matched the fire notice I had read days earlier, though now they held a sharper resonance. We examined the key hooks again. Every brass number gleamed dutifully except one. A thin film of dust traced the outline of a hook that had been empty until very recently. The missing key was to the service passage. Returned at dawn, perhaps, or in the hour before we arrived. Lewis frowned. He asked if I believed someone had guided Mrs. Arbery through that door. So I told him guiding and forcing are not the same, but both can kill. He looked unconvinced, which was his habit. We left the guest house and stood in the lane where the river mist blurred the outlines of the saloon still parked beneath the U. Its plate, OXF 8797A, remained smugly unreadable beneath its artful smudge. A plate altered is a story edited, I told myself. The porter's corrected digit, the proprietor's reluctance, the commas in Elspeth's letter, all were the same hand, revising reality. Back in my rooms later that night, I unfolded the crossword again. Escape route 5. The answer was obvious, door, yet I hesitated before filling it in. The clue permitted plural, but the grid would not. Only one door allowed when in truth there were two. I stared at the empty square, felt the symmetry resist me and put down the pen. The whiskey did not soften the thought. Elspeth had been afraid of the second door, not because it threatened violence, but because it offered silence. She had been led gently toward a choice disguised as inevitability. Her key borrowed, a passage rehearsed, a door opened not by her but for her. Lewis would ask again in the morning for facts. I would tell him facts have faces, and faces wear masks. He would sigh, and we would drive back to the college, where Merrick would recite sorrow, where Marion would shelve her grief, where Livia would smile too brightly, and where Keene would misquote Eliot with the confidence of a man who believes his own emendations. But tonight, as the chapel's darkness held me in memory, I thought only of doors. Two doors, one open, one closed, one honest, one corrected, and of Elspeth Arbery pausing on a threshold, sensing the hand behind her elbow, and fearing that whichever way she turned, silence would follow. Arithmetic is rarely simple in Oxford. Numbers hide within the folds of memory, and memory is prone to subtraction. I sat in my rooms that night with the pamphlet of poems, the blurred register, the letter that breathed in the wrong places. When arranged together, they resembled not harmony but equation. Each symbol asked to be balanced. Elspeth Arbery's diary, -1 page, had been a ledger of her youth when affection was spent carelessly, as though credit were endless. Somewhere in 1967 she had chosen, or been chosen, and the record had been excised with too steady a hand to be accident. I pictured the page folded in a stranger's pocket even now, a sum withheld to skew the total. Keene's arrival at St. Simeon's had been the variable no one admitted to solving. He had cultivated Marion's widowhood with polite sympathy, Livia's cleverness with flattering impatience, Merrick's burdens with feigned admiration. He had discovered the pamphlet, or guessed at its codes, and understood enough of Oxford's algebra to make himself indispensable. He had persuaded Elspeth that her bequest should be bent toward English, toward words, toward the resurrection of her younger self. But she, who had lived long enough to recognize exploitation, even when dressed in scholarship, had hesitated at the last. Lewis said to me that perhaps hesitation was the cause of her death, that she had turned her indecision inward, as the elderly sometimes do. I told him hesitation can be arranged as carefully as murder. He frowned, scratched his head, and suggested more facts. I thought of the guest house register, the smudged initial E. I had assumed it was Elspeth herself, lodging quietly under an abbreviated name. But the handwriting leaned left, not right, the blot symmetrical as if written by a hand not used to English pens. Keene's ex-wife, I remembered suddenly, bore the same initial. She had threatened him before he had admitted in passing, a confession disguised as anecdote. It was she who had arrived in Oxford, unbooked, whose presence he had sought to conceal by revising entries, by correcting plates, by inventing sevens. The arithmetic began to settle. 2 women with the same initial, 2 doors at the guest house, 2 drafts of a will. Keene had balanced his equation by subtraction. 1 diary page, 1 nameplate, 1 life. Merrick, with his weary grace, had seemed a plausible culprit, but plausibility is the cheapest denominator. Marian's blush, Livia's withheld page, both were footnotes, not answers. Only Keene had misquoted Eliot with such confidence, bending language until it drowned its own author. That misquotation had been my first proof. The service passage key haunted me most. Taken, returned, its absence noted only by dust. I imagined Elspeth standing on the landing, persuaded that a side door would lead to discretion, to calm, to escape from confrontation. Instead, it had led her into silence. She had not been pushed. She had been arranged. And arrangement can be crueler than force. I poured another whiskey and unfolded the crossword. The clue waiting there, balance of account 8. I toyed with equation, then with statement. The crossings yielded arithmetic, too obvious and yet perfect. The past's arithmetic. Add 1 poet's blush, subtract 1 diary page, multiply suspicion by vanity, divide the silence by 2 doors. The answer, however ugly, would not alter. Lewis knocked then, reporting that the saloon's number plate had peeled at 1 corner. A stick-on digit printed cheaply, fraud as mundane as wallpaper. He seemed proud of the discovery, and I allowed him his pride. But I thought only of the photograph in the SCR, of the absent nameplate, of the young man's face turned askew. Every equation carries a remainder. The rain began again, steady as calculation, and I let the numbers arrange themselves on the table before me. Elspeth had hesitated, yes, but hesitation is not fatal until another hand steadies it. Keene had balanced his variables too neatly. The arithmetic of guilt, like all mathematics, depended not on invention but on the elegance of omission. I closed the crossword without filling in the clue. Arithmetic, like Oxford, prefers its sums unfinished. The room in which I confronted Keene was disappointingly ordinary. A college drawing room with pale wallpaper, a clock that kept time reluctantly, and a rug worn thin where chairs had been shifted too often. Yet I remember it as a kind of theatre, though the performance was played in lowered voices. He sat angled toward the fire, the smoke curling in a way that suited him. He said that Elspeth had always written of silence, that she sought it as one seeks rest. He said he had merely assisted her toward what she already desired. He had that American charm that turns cruelty into philosophy. I reminded him of Eliot, of human voices drowning us. He corrected me again, obstinate, wake us. He preferred the error, he said, because hope was kinder. I repeated the true line with no emphasis. His smile wavered just slightly, as though a mask had slipped but not fallen. Marian was brought in by Lewis, reluctant, but she stood straighter than I expected. She confirmed that the service passage key had gone missing the day before and had been returned quietly in the night. Her voice did not tremble, though her hands folded and refolded themselves like unanswered letters. Livia followed, with her usual brightness dimmed. She produced from her cardigan pocket the missing diary page, crumpled, carefully preserved, and damning. It spoke of a meeting arranged, of a door, of a decision deferred. It spoke of someone who had promised discretion, but demanded surrender. She had hesitated to show it, she confessed, because she feared what truths would undo. Merrick arrived last, his face already rehearsed in sadness. He did not deny that the college had debts, that the bequest mattered, that his own position depended upon Arbery's generosity. But his melancholy was consistent, unperformed. A guilty man plays his role more energetically. He merely looked tired, as though the performance of dignity had drained him. The saloon, meanwhile, had betrayed its owner. Lewis reported that the number plate's final digit had begun to peel at one corner. A stick-on 7, bought cheaply, a masquerade intended to misdirect. Beneath it, the true sequence matched the porter's first entry, OXF 879A. Keen's ex-wife had hired a man to find him, it seemed. He had chosen to disguise his movements with amateur ingenuity. When I suggested this aloud, Keen leaned back in his chair and admitted it almost with pride. He said that life was arrangement, a digit added here, a door opened there. He insisted that he had not pushed Elspeth, had not forced her hand. He had merely given her choices, which in the end amounted to the same thing. Lewis muttered that the CPS would have a word for it. I said cruelty was sufficient. Silence fell then, the kind that grows rather than diminishes. Marion looked at the floor. Livia folded the diary page once more. Merrick closed his eyes. Keen smiled faintly into the fire, as though content to have performed his argument regardless of verdict. Strange telephoned at that precise moment, as though fate had conspired to punctuate. He said charges would follow, that arrangements could be made. I listened, said little, and hung up. I walked out into the quad. The rain had begun again, steady and without drama, pooling at the foot of the worn steps. I lit a cigarette and thought of Elspeth Arbery standing on a landing. Persuaded that one door was preferable to another. Persuaded by a man who could edit poetry, diaries, number plates, even memory itself. In my pocket the crossword still waited. Cruel sum, says. The letters now aligned for one word. Arang, I forced them into orang, then let the clue stand unfinished. Because cruelty is never neat, never 6 letters, never confined to the grid. Oxford's bells began to mark the hour, too many of them at once, colliding in mid-air. A reckoning, I thought, is rarely loud. It arrives quietly, when the mask slips just enough, when the missing page surfaces, when the digit peels at the corner. It had arrived tonight without flourish, and it left me not satisfied but weary. And so I returned to my rooms, poured another whiskey, and let the reckoning settle like ash in a glass. There are funerals to which one is not invited, and I have attended more of those in my imagination than in reality. Elspeth Arbery was buried in a village churchyard some miles from Oxford. The choir sang without conviction, or so I was told, and the college sent a wreath designed more for balance than sentiment. I did not go. I walked by the river instead, where the wind unsettled the water into a language of its own. Marion had declined a drink with a grace that felt like reproach. Admiration, she said once, had its season, and mine had come too late. Livia left me a note in a hand both careless and deliberate, a single line of verse without acrostic or code, as though she had chosen finally not to hide. Merrick wrote that music would, after all, receive its share of the bequest. He said it as though generosity could erase arithmetic. The choir rehearsed again in the chapel. Their intonation had improved oddly, as if grief had imposed discipline where affection could not. The bell, too, seemed sharper, less indulgent of delay. I listened from the cloister, cigarette burning low, and thought how institutions absorb death with the same efficiency as stone absorbs rain. In my rooms that night, I spread the crossword across the table. I had left Janus incomplete for days, unwilling to commit the obvious. Tonight I filled it in at last, but the crossings yielded another word unexpected, veritas. Truth concealed until the right letters aligned. A coincidence, perhaps. Yet truth, I reminded myself, often wears the appearance of coincidence until one reads it twice. The wine ledger still lay on my desk, its trivial error, guest house charged instead of college, staring up at me. A pedant had slipped, or a liar had disguised precision as carelessness. It hardly mattered now. The CPS would define cruelty in their language, and Keene would listen to it with the same detachment with which he had quoted Eliot. But I thought of the smallness of the detail, how it had bent the light just enough to show the shape of the shadow. Truth again in pedantry. I returned to the guest house once more before leaving Oxford. The second door stood on the landing, paint peeling where the handle had been overused. I touched it gently, as though it might yield a confession. It opened into its narrow passage, smelling of lime wash and absence. I closed it again, imagining Elspeth's hesitation, the hand at her elbow, the persuasion dressed as kindness. 2 doors, one leading back to the lounge and noise, the other to the silence in which she was found. Janus would have approved of the symmetry. Lewis asked if I thought justice had been done. I told him justice is a word for clerks. Truth is lonelier, less certain. He shrugged, not unkindly, and changed the subject to football. I envied him his pragmatism. Later, with the city at rest, I thought of Elspeth as she must have been, young, writing her poems with initials that revealed more than they concealed, turning her face slightly from the camera, as though doubting its promise. 2 doors had opened for her then as well, one toward a future of quiet compromises, the other toward a passion too awkward to keep. She had chosen, and the arithmetic of that choice had carried forward across decades, until another hand corrected the sum. I closed my eyes. The rain pressed faintly at the window, steady as memory. I thought of 2 doors again and of one face, hers. A woman who had tried to keep silence at bay, only to be offered silence as her final refuge. And I thought of the title I would never speak aloud, though it had arranged itself in my mind as neatly as any crossword. 2 doors opened. One led to silence. The river outside continued its endless translation of sorrow into sound. I let it speak for me.